Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, subtitled Poverty and Profit in the American City. We are beginning chapter 1. Chapter 1 is entitled The Business of Owning the City. Before the city yielded to winter, as cold and gray as a mechanic's wrench, before Arlene convinced Sharina Tarver to let her boys move into the 13th Street duplex, the inner city was crackling with life. It was early September and Milwaukee was enjoying an Indian summer. Music rolled into the streets from car speakers as children played on the sidewalk or sold water bottles by the freeway entrance. Grandmothers watched from porch chairs as bare-chested black boys laughingly made their way to the basketball court. Sharina wound her way through the north side, listening to R&B with her windows down. Most middle-class Milwaukeeans zoomed past the inner city on the freeway. Landlords took the side streets, typically not in their Saab or Audi, but in their, quote, rent collector, end quote. Some oil-leaking, rusted-out van or truck that hauled around extension cords, ladders, maybe a loaded pistol, plumbing snakes, toolboxes, a can of mace, nail guns, and other necessities. Sharina usually left her lipstick red Camaro at home and visited tenants in a beige and brown 1993 Chevy Suburban with 20-inch rims. The Suburban belonged to Quentin, Sharina's husband, business partner, and property manager. He used a screwdriver to start it. Some white Milwaukeeans still referred to the North Side as, quote, the core, end quote, as they did in the 1960s, and if they ventured into it, they saw street after street of sagging duplexes, fading murals, 24-hour daycares, and corner stores with "WIC accepted here" signs. Once America's 11th largest city, Milwaukee's population had fallen below 600,000, down from over 740,000 in 1960. It showed. Abandoned properties and weedy lots where houses once stood dotted the north side. A typical residential street had a few single-family homes owned by older folks who tended gardens and hung American flags, more duplexes or four-family apartment buildings with chipping paint and bedsheet curtains rented to struggling families, and vacant plots and empty houses with boards drilled over their doors and windows. Sharina saw all this, but she saw something else too. Like other seasoned landlords, she knew who owned which multifamily, which church, which bar, which street. Knew its different vicissitudes of life, its shades and moods. Knew which blocks were hot and drug-soaked and which were stable and quiet. She knew the ghetto's value and how money could be made from a property that looked worthless to people who didn't know any better. Petite with chestnut skin, Sharina wore a lightweight red and blue jacket that matched her pants, which matched her off-kilter NBA cap. She liked to laugh, a full, open-mouth hoot, sometimes catching your shoulder as if to keep from falling. But as she turned off North Avenue on her way to pay a visit to tenants who lived near the intersection of 18th and Wright Streets, she slowed down and let out a heavy sigh. Evictions were a regular part of the business, but Lamar didn't have any legs. Sharina was not looking forward to evicting a man without legs. When Lamar first fell behind, Sharina didn't reach automatically for the eviction notice or shrug it off with a bromide about business being business. She hemmed and hawed. Quote, "I'm going to have a hard time doing this," end quote, she told Quentin when she could no longer ignore it. Quote, "You know that, don't you?" End quote, Sharina frowned. Quentin stayed quiet and let his wife say it. Quote, "It's only fair," end quote, Sharina offered after a few silent moments of deliberation. Quote, "I feel bad for the kids. Lamar's got them little boys in there. And I love Lamar, but love don't pay the bills," end quote. Sharina had a lot of bills. Mortgage payments, water charges, maintenance expenses, property taxes. Sometimes a major expense would come out of nowhere, a broken furnace, an unexpected bill from the city, and leave her close to broke until the first of the month. Quote, "We don't have time to wait," end quote, Quentin said. Quote, "While we waiting on his payment, the taxes are going up. The mortgage payment is going up," end quote. There was no hedging in this business. When a tenant didn't pay $500, her landlord lost $500. When that happened, landlords with mortgages dug into their savings or their income to make sure the bank didn't hand them a foreclosure notice. There were no euphemisms either. No, quote, downsizing, end quote. No, quote, quarterly losses, end quote. Landlords took the gains and losses directly. They saw the deprivation and waste up close. Old timers liked recalling their first big loss, their initial breaking in, the time a tenant tore down her own ceiling, took pictures, and convinced the court commissioner it was the landlord's fault. The time an evicted couple stuffed socks down the sinks and turned the water on full blast before moving out. Rookie landlords hardened or quit. Sharina nodded reassuringly and said, almost to herself, quote, I guess I gotta stop feeling sorry for these people because nobody is feeling sorry for me. Last time I checked, the mortgage company still wanted their money, end quote. So let's have a small reflection here. It's a changing of the theme within this chapter. And what stands out to me in these first few minutes that we just read is the downsize of the population of the city of Milwaukee. Milwaukee is in Wisconsin, which is a Midwestern city, Midwestern state. I have not personally been to Milwaukee. I know a lot of people who have been to Milwaukee. I know some people who have moved to Milwaukee for work purposes. Some friends on social media who are from Milwaukee. And Milwaukee is a city that's similar to Chicago and Rockford and Detroit and Cleveland and some of these Midwestern cities that were built a lot on the automotive industry and on industrialization and factory work. And a lot of those jobs were I don't know if outsource is the right word, but were removed from being in America and were put overseas because people could make more of a profit by paying people less money to do those jobs overseas. It was a time when they were paying black people of color, less money to do them here. And as labor unions strengthened and labor laws began to expand, it became more profitable to send these companies overseas. And so that's some of the things I think of when I hear about the loss in population and the time period when it had more population. Also, the scene that is being painted by Matthew Desmond of the inner city is one that is very common to what we've seen painted of the inner city in Chicago, what we've seen. I don't know how many other books we've read about any other specific inner cities, but if you read a book about Detroit or if you read a book about Cleveland, if you read news stories about Rockford, news stories about some of these other cities in this area, this is a commonality that you'll hear about when somebody is talking about the way that they look, when you talk about the exterior of the homes in the neighborhood and the streets and things like that. And so those are just some of the first thoughts that stand out to me is the familiarity that Milwaukee has with other Midwestern cities. And then this is my first time personally reading about the opposite side of housing of somebody. Well, I guess in The Color of Law, we haven't read The Color of Law yet. That's a book that we're going to read here very soon because it's very important and it touches on some of these similar things. So here, let's just get back to reading. Sharina and Quentin had met years ago on Fond du Lac Avenue. Quentin pulled up beside Sharina at a red light. She had a gorgeous smile and her car stereo was turned up. He asked her to pull over. Sharina remembered Quentin being in a Daytona, but he insisted it was the Regal. Quote, I ain't trying to pull nobody over in the Daytona, end quote, he'd say, feigning offense. Quentin was well manicured, built but not muscular, with curly hair and lots of jewelry, a thick chain, a thicker bracelet, rings. Sharina thought he looked like a dope dealer, but gave him her real number anyway. Quentin called Sharina for 3 months before she agreed to let him take her out for ice cream. It took him another 6 years to marry her. When Quentin pulled Sharina over, she was a 4th grade teacher. She talked like a teacher, calling strangers, quote, honey, end quote, and offering motherly advice or chiding. Quote, "You know I'm fixing to fuss at you," end quote, she would say. If she sensed your attention starting to drift, she would touch your elbow or thigh to pull you back in. 4 years after meeting Quentin, Sharina was happy with their relationship but bored at work. After 8 years in the classroom, she quit and opened a daycare. But, quote, "they shut it down on a tiny technicality," end quote, she remembered. So she went back to teaching. After her son from an earlier relationship started acting out, she began homeschooling him and tried her hand at real estate. When people asked, quote, "why real estate?" end quote, Sharina would reply with some talk about, quote, "long-term residuals" or property being the best investment out there, end quote. But there was more to it. Sharina shared something with other landlords, an unbending confidence that she could make it on her own without a school or a company to fall back on, without a contract or a pension or a union. She had an understanding with the universe that she could strike out into nothing and through her own gumption and intelligence come back with a good living. Sharina had bought a home in 1999 when prices were low. Riding the housing boom a few years later, she refinanced and pulled out $21,000 in equity. 6 months later, she refinanced again, this time pulling $12,000. She used the cash to buy her first rental property, a 2-unit duplex in the inner city where housing was cheapest. Rental profits, refinancing, and private real estate investors offering high interest loans helped her buy more. She learned that the rental population comprised some upper and middle class households who rent out of preference or circumstance, some young and transient people, and most of the city's poor who were excluded both from home ownership and public housing. Landlords operated in different neighborhoods, typically clustering their properties in a concentrated area. In the segregated city, this meant that landlords focused on housing certain kinds of people, white ones or black ones, poor families or college students. Sharina decided to specialize in renting to the black poor. 4 years later, she owned 36 units, all in the inner city, and took to carrying a pair of cell phones with backup batteries, reading Forbes, renting office space, and accepting appointments from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Quentin quit his job and started working as Sharina's property manager and buying buildings of his own. Sharina started a credit repair business and an investment business. She purchased two 15-passenger vans and started Prisoner Connections LLC, which for $25 to $50 a seat transported girlfriends and mothers and children to visit their incarcerated loved ones upstate. Sharina had found her calling, inner city entrepreneur. Sharina parked in front of Lamar's place and reached for a pair of eviction notices. The property sat just off Wright Street with empty lots and a couple of street memorials for murder victims. Teddy bears, Black & Mild cigars, and scribbled notes lashed to tree trunks. It was a 4-family property consisting of 2 detached 2-story buildings, one directly behind the other. The houses were longer than they were wide, with rough wood balconies painted blue-gray like the trim and vinyl siding that was the brownish white of leftover milk in a cereal bowl. The house facing the street had 2 doors for the upper and lower units and a pair of wooden steps leading to each, one old with peeling paint, the other new and unvarnished. Lamar lived in the lower unit of the back house, which abutted the alley. When Sharina pulled up, he was outside being pushed. Sorry about that, trying to turn the page. When Sharina pulled up, he was outside being pushed in a wheelchair by Patrice, whose name was on the other eviction notice. He had snapped on his plastic prosthetic legs. An older black man, Lamar was wiry, youthful from the waist up, with skin the color of wet sand. He had a shaved head and a thin mustache, flecked with gray. He wore a yellow sports jersey with his keys around his neck. Quote, "Oh, I got 2 at the same time," end quote, Sharina tried to say lightly. She handed Lamar and Patrice their eviction notices. Quote, "You almost been late," end quote, Patrice said. She wore a head wrap, pajama pants, and a white tank top that showed off her tattoo on her right arm. A cross and a ribbon with the names of her 3 children. At 24, Patrice was half Lamar's age, but her eyes looked older. She and her children lived in the upper unit of the front house. Her mother, Doreen Hickston, and her 3 younger siblings lived below her in the bottom floor unit. Patrice creased her eviction notice and jammed it into a pocket. Quote, "I'm fixing to go to practice," end quote, Lamar said from his seat. Quote, "What practice?" end quote, Sharina asked. Quote, "My kids' football practice," end quote. He looked at the paper in his hand. Quote, "You know, we fixing to do the basement. I'm already started," end quote. Quote, "He didn't tell me about that," end quote, Sharina replied. Quote, "He," end quote, being Quentin. Sometimes tenants worked off the rent by doing odd jobs for landlords, like cleaning out basements. Quote, "You better call me. Don't forget who the boss is," end quote, Sharina joked. Lamar smiled back at her. As Patrice began pushing Lamar down the street, Sharina went over a checklist in her head. There were so many things to deal with: repairs, collections, moves, advertisements, inspectors, social workers, cops. The swirl of work, a million little things regularly interrupted by some big thing, had been encroaching on her Sunday soul food dinners with her mom. Just a month earlier, someone had been shot in one of her properties. A tenant's new boyfriend had taken 3 pumps to the chest, and blood had run down him like a full-on faucet. After police officers had asked their questions and balled up the yellow tape, Sharina and Quentin were stuck with the cleanup. Quentin sat on it with a couple guys, rubber gloves, and a shop vac. Quote, "Here you come with a boyfriend that I don't know anything about," end quote, Sharina asked the tenant. Quentin dealt with messes. Sharina dealt with people. That was the arrangement. Then, a few days after the shooting, another tenant phoned Sharina to say that her house was being shut down. Sharina didn't believe it until she pulled up and spotted white men in hard hats screwing green boards over her windows. The tenants had been caught stealing electricity, so the We Energies men had disconnected service at the pole and placed a call to the Department of Neighborhood Services, DNS. The tenants had to be out that day. In Milwaukee and across the nation, most renters were responsible for keeping the lights and heat on, but that had become increasingly difficult to do. Since 2000, the cost of fuels and utilities had risen by more than 50% thanks to increasing global demand and the expiration of price caps. In a typical year, almost 1 in 5 poor renting families nationwide missed payments and received a disconnection notice from their utility company. Families who couldn't both make rent and keep current with the utility company sometimes paid a cousin or neighbor to reroute the meter. As much as $6 billion worth of power was pirated across America every year. Only cars and credit cards got stolen more. Stealing gas was much more difficult and rare. It was also unnecessary in the wintertime when the city put a moratorium on disconnections. On that April day when the moratorium lifted, gas operators returned to poor neighborhoods with their stacks of disconnection notices and toolboxes. We Energies disconnected roughly 50,000 households each year for non-payment. Many tenants who in the winter stayed current on their rent at the expense of their heating bill tried in the summer to climb back in the black with the utility company by shorting their landlord. Come the following winter, they had to be connected to benefit from the moratoriums on disconnection. So every year in Milwaukee, evictions spiked in the summer and early fall and dipped again in November when the moratoriums began. Sharina watched the DNS hard hats march around her property. There were few things that frustrated landlords more than clipboard in hand building inspectors. When they were not shutting down a property, they were scrutinizing apartments for code violations. Upon requests, DNS would send a building inspector to any property. The service was designed to protect the city's most vulnerable renters from negligent landlords. But to Sharina and other property owners, tenants called for small, cosmetic things, and often because they were trying to stop an eviction or retaliate against landlords. Sharina thought about the money she had just lost, a few $1,000s for electrical work and unpaid rent. She remembered taking a chance on this family, feeling sorry for the mother who had told Sharina she was trying to leave her abusive boyfriend. Sharina had decided to rent to her and her children, even though the woman had been evicted 3 times in the past 2 years. Quote, "There's me having a heart again," end quote, she thought. Okay, so let's have a reflection on the passage that we just read. Okay, so Let's have a small reflection. What stands out to me is the the having to rob Peter to pay Paul mentality that exists in the tenants in Milwaukee, because they don't have enough money to afford to be able to pay rent, get groceries, get things that they may need to live in the house or to live day to day, pay utilities, pay for maybe gas for a car or transportation to get back and forth to work. When the wintertime comes, they take that as a way to neglect paying one bill, since they know that this electricity won't be cut off, because they know that the power won't be cut off because of the laws that are in place, and they try to make sure that they can stay up on the rent. And then when they have to try to dig themselves out of that hole, then they stop paying the rent. And again, when you have experienced some of these things, like I've been in a situation where you just don't have enough money to pay for all the things that need to be paid for, and so you're trying to constantly be in a state of paying some of this, pay this week, pay some of this the next week, pay some of this the next week, and you never can really get to a stable position. And I think one of the things that's not talked about a lot with people who are in these type of situations is that no one wants to have to not pay all of their rent, or not pay all of their utilities, or not be able to have food in the refrigerator, or not be able to have clothes to put on their back. But these situations that people are in are cyclical. That, and I've talked about this before, if you're born poor, most likely you're going to die poor. If you're born in the middle class, most likely you're going to die in the middle class. If you're born wealthy and rich, most likely you'll die wealthy and rich. And so when you have an understanding of that, you understand how difficult it is for people to climb out of some of these situations financially that they and economically that they are in. And so that stands out to me immediately from the passages that we just read there. And all right, let's try to get one more segment in and finish up this chapter, and then we'll wrap this up and start back, or get ready to come back tomorrow. Let's continue reading. Sharina drove off Wright Street and headed north. Since she was in this part of town, she decided to make one more stop, her duplex on 13th and Keith. Sharina had let a new tenant move in the previous month with a partial rent and security deposit payment. The tenant was sitting on her stoop in a long-sleeved flannel shirt, hushing a colicky baby and talking with her mother, who was leaning against the car. Seeing Sharina, the young woman wasted no time. Quote, "My son is sick because my house is cold," end quote, she said. Her voice was tired. Quote, "The window have a hole in it and I've been waiting patiently. I mean, I'm ready to move," end quote. Sharina tilted her head, confused. The window had a hole, not a crater, and it was warm enough outside that children were still swimming in Lake Michigan. How could the house be cold? Quote, "I done called the city," end quote, the mother added, peeling herself off the car. She was slender and tall, her hair frizzy by the late summer humidity. Sharina took a breath. There were worse houses on the block, but Sharina knew her place on 13th Street wasn't up to code. She would say almost no house in the city was, a commentary on the mismatch between Milwaukee's worn-out housing stock and its exact building code. Thanks to the tenant's mother, an inspector would arrive in a few days. He would jiggle the stair banister, photograph the hole in the window, shimmy the unhinged front door. Every code violation would cost Sharina money. Quote, "That wasn't right for you to do that," end quote, Sharina said. Quote, "Because I was working with her," end quote. Quote, "Then fix the window," end quote, the mother replied. Quote, "We will, but if she don't call us to let us know," end quote. Quote, "She don't have no phone. That's why I called," end quote, the mother interrupted. As the conversation grew louder, a crowd gathered. Quote, "Who's she?" end quote, a young boy asked. Quote, "Landlord," end quote, came a reply. Quote, "I didn't know you were going to call the building inspector, Mama," end quote, the tenant said, nervously. Quote, "It's too late now. The damage is done," end quote, Sharina said. She shook her head and, hands on her hips, looked at the young woman with the baby. Quote, "It's always the ones that I try to help that I have the problems out of. And I'm not saying that you a problem, but it's just that somebody else is involved and you the one living here. So it puts you in a spot," end quote. Quote, well, let me ask you something, end quote. The tenant's mother stepped closer and the crowd with her. Quote, if this was your daughter and these were your grandkids, what would you do? End quote. Sharina didn't step back. She looked up at the mother, noticing her gold front tooth, and answered, quote, I would have definitely made a connection with the landlord and not called the city, end quote. Sharina pushed past the crowd and stepped briskly to her car. When she got home, she opened the door and yelled, quote, Quentin, we done walked straight into some bullshit, end quote. Sharina sat down in her paper-cluttered home office. The office was one of five bedrooms in Sharina and Quentin's home, which sat in the quiet middle-class black neighborhood off Capitol Drive. The house had a finished basement with an insect jacuzzi tub. Excuse me. I was like, insect, what? Sharina and Quentin have furnished it with beige leather furniture, large brass and crystal light fixtures, and gold-colored curtains. The kitchen was spacious and unused, since they ate out most days. Typically, the only things in the refrigerator were restaurant doggy bags. Quote, huh? End quote. Quentin called back, coming down the stairs. Quote, the girl downstairs at 13th Street. Her mama done called the building inspector. Her mother was outside talking shit, end quote. Quentin listened to the story and said, quote, put her out, end quote. Sharina thought about it for a moment, then agreed. She reached in a drawer and began filling out a 5-day eviction notice. The law forbade landlords from retaliating against tenants who contacted DNS, but landlords could at any time evict tenants for being behind on rent or for other violations. By the time Quentin and Sharina pulled the Suburban onto 13th Street, night had fallen. The apartment door was open. Sharina walked right through it without knocking and handed the young tenant an eviction notice, saying, quote, here, I hope you get some assistance, end quote. A man followed Sharina out the door and stood on the unlit porch. Quote, excuse me, end quote. He called out as Sharina met Quentin in the street. Quote, you're evicting her, end quote. Quote, she told me she wanted to move, so that let me know she wasn't going to pay anything else, end quote. Sharina answered. Quote, she told you she wanted the windows fixed, end quote. Quentin interjected, looking at Sharina. Quote, he ain't got nothing to do with it, end quote. Quote, I got everything to do with it, blood. This my stepdaughter here, end quote. Quote, you don't even stay here though, man, end quote. Quentin yelled back. Quote, ain't nobody want to live like that. Fuck you mean? I don't have nothing to do with it, end quote. Quentin opened the Suburban's door and pulled out a security belt, equipped with handcuffs, a small baton, and a canister of mace the size of a small fire extinguisher. Quentin had been here before. There was the tenant who told him he was going to take a security deposit out of Quentin's pocket. There was the one who said he was going to shoot him in the face. The tenant's mother joined the stepfather on the dark porch. Quote, are you evicting her? End quote, she asked. Quote, she didn't pay her rent, end quote, Sharina said. Quote, do y'all have her rent to pay? End quote. Quote, I don't give a shit, man, end quote, the stepfather was saying almost to himself. What he didn't give a shit about wasn't the eviction, but whatever was going to transpire there at that very moment on that dark street. Quote, I don't either, end quote, Quentin shot back. Quote, I'll whip that motherfucking ass, nigga. Don't say I ain't got nothing to do with it, end quote. Quote, you don't, end quote, Sharina yelled as Quentin tugged her back to the Suburban. Quote, you don't, end quote. Days after the tenant left, Sharina took a call from a caseworker at Wraparound, a local social service agency. The caseworker had a client who needed a place to live with their 2 boys. Wraparound would pay her security Wraparound would pay her security deposit and first month's rent, which sounded good to Sharina. The new tenant's name was Arlene Bell. And that brings us to the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So, upon reflection, what stands out to me is the fact that this is a black landlord with a black husband who's part of the business, basically essentially a black business, and They're trying to help Black people that have these homes in the Black community, but because they are essentially not, they don't. Sharina is not over abundantly wealthy, and so she needs the rent to be paid on time. She needs a deposit. She needs all these things on time so that she can maintain what she has going. And the people who she is trying to help out are people who are in positions of desperation as well. People who are living check to check as well. People who are sometimes not even able to make it to the next check, and they're also Black. And so it just exasperates the inner community uh, turmoil when you look at it like that. I think a lot of times we talk some of the books that we've read specifically with the High Risers book, and then again we haven't read it here on this podcast, but we did read it as an organization, the Color of Law. Both of those books sort of put you in the perspective of seeing how Black people or people of color deal with white people, or the government being the ones who are in charge of the homes, or the landlords are in charge of the land, or owning the land that these homes are on. And it's a different perspective to see when it's both parties are Black, what that how that transpires, and how that what that experience is like. One of the other things that stood out to me is, and it wasn't in this passage we just read, but in the previous passage, one of the things that stood out was they talked about how the city of Milwaukee was segregated, and how, Black people, poor Black people lived in a certain section, middle class Black people live in a certain section, middle class white people live in a certain section, and so on and so forth. And that's the cases for not just a lot of Midwestern cities, but for a lot of cities in general in this country. And one of the biggest myths about this nation is that segregation no longer exists. And in truth, and this is not a factual statement right here, but segregation exists to a very close percentage wise as to what it existed in the 1950s or in the 1960s, whether that be looking at school districts, or whether that be looking at the areas of town that people live in. And so I think that this just does a very good job of, or books about housing do a very good job of sort of pulling back that veil, and dispelling that myth that the country is integrated as a whole. Okay, so this is a longer episode. I believe I recorded this in segments. Well, I mean, I always recorded in segments, but this was recorded throughout multiple weeks. And so please share this whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily, where we will begin reading chapter 2 of Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow.